Thank you, Saheli. Thank you so much to the organizers for putting this very important event together. Actually, the situation has escalated significantly since the event was put together, and the present Sierra was mentioning before that now there's an aircraft carrier with its strike group headed towards the Mediterranean, and so it's very important to do this. And I'm also very pleased to see so many people here, also some familiar faces and names that I have been fortunate enough to run across over these past few years. So before talking about Guyana, just a small thing. I mean, I have the advantage of going after many great speakers who have already laid out a lot of the context, but just something to make explicit. When we talk about the quote unquote narco-terrorism narrative, people have already said that this is completely unfounded, but it's important to also include the counterfactuals. So all the reports that have ever been produced on drug trafficking in Latin America completely contradict this idea that Venezuela is a major player in drug trafficking. Of course, the Trump administration is permanently divorced from facts, but when it comes to activism, it's important to be armed with this so we can tell people that this is a completely manufactured excuse to justify this military buildup. So, for example, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime has consistently shown that most of the cocaine that is produced to a large extent in Colombia and to a smaller extent in Bolivia and Peru, it goes to the US via the Pacific and via Central America. And I mean, you can decide if correlation is cause, but it goes through the countries where the DEA has historically had a strong presence. And then there's a smaller fraction that goes through the Caribbean, and through the Eastern Caribbean, through Venezuela and Trinidad, it actually goes through to Europe and West Africa. I mean, not to mention that these small speedboats would need to refuel 20 times if they were to ever get to US shores. So that on one hand. There's an article on Venezuela Analysis that I mean, it's also been republished elsewhere, from Pino Arlacchi. He's an Italian former director of this United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, and he explains how this narco-terrorism narrative is completely unfounded. It's something that's actually been recurrent in the US discourse and the media discourse, something that's been reheated over time. It began with Chavez cooperating with the FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, to quote unquote flood the US with cocaine, and then Chavez was no longer around, the FARC was no longer around, and so they just did a find and replace in these documents and brought this absurd bounties on Maduro and other Venezuelan high-ranking leaders. And even the DEA, the US DEA, if you want to take it from the imperial horse's mouth, if you go to the 2024 DEA annual report on drugs, you can search and the word Venezuela does not even appear. So this is something that Carlos was mentioning in the beginning, that for years we had these regime change efforts hinging on this idea of bringing freedom and democracy. And then Rubio and the neocons realized that this was not going to convince Trump, and so they manufactured this whole narco-terrorism narrative, which is what we're seeing now. And it's important to understand. Of course, it's unfounded, but it's important to have the data to strike back. So on to the topic that I was asked to talk about, the Guyana flank in terms of the imperialist aggression against Venezuela. This also ties to something that other speakers have said, which is that these attacks have not begun now. The Venezuelan revolution has been under attack almost from day one. And in the case of Guyana, just to make a very long story short, this is a 200-year-old border dispute concerning the so-called Essequibo Strip, which when Venezuela gained independence, this was part of the Spanish dominions, and thus even the United Kingdom at the time, which had the dominions to the east, recognized it. But then, as it expanded, it started to find gold, and it began encroaching further and further into this Venezuelan territory. We're talking about the late 19th century. There was a dispute. The United States actually intervened under the Monroe Doctrine. And then in the late 19th century, there was an arbitration tribunal, which was later proven to be rigged, which assigned this big chunk of territory to the United Kingdom. And then when Guyana became independent, it inherited the Essequibo Strip. And then later, I mean, this issue was brought up again, and there was what is the most important document, which is the 1966 Geneva Agreement, which established that the newly independent Guyana and Venezuela would reach some kind of amicable, I'm paraphrasing, some kind of amicable settlement for this border dispute. And this was largely dormant, including in times of better relations in the beginning of the century, until these massive discoveries of oil starting from 2015, and which ExxonMobil has kind of imposed a retroactive revenge for having its assets rightfully nationalized by the Chavez government by going head first and extracting all this oil wealth on the shores, on the maritime waters of the Essequibo. So this flank has been growingly active, and unsurprisingly, the United States has gone in fully on the side of Guyana and saying, this is Guyanese territory, and we are going to defend Guyana from any aggression from Venezuela, which has never really been on the cards. And using that excuse, there has been a larger military buildup in Guyana, joint military exercises. The Venezuelan government has repeatedly denounced that there are either U.S. bases already in Guyana or plans to build them. We have to understand that, the concept of a U.S. base has become much looser as time goes on. There are these very mobile bases that they call lily pads. There may be local bases that house U.S. assets. So, I mean, we can be fairly certain that there are U.S. military assets in Guyana, even if there isn't some military base with the U.S. flag that you can see from a satellite. And so this has consistently been an escalation, and with this simmering idea that if necessary, the U.S. can try to stoke a kind of a proxy conflict using Guyana to attack Venezuela. As for the legal resolution of the dispute itself, right now there is a process going on in the International Court of Justice, which has been very long and protracted, with Guyana asking the court to enforce this 1899 arbitration ruling that assigns the territory to Guyana. And Venezuela has participated and it has presented its evidence of sovereignty over the territory, but has at the same time said that it does not recognize ICJ jurisdiction to settle this issue. And the court is going to review documentation early next year. It may come to a resolution later. But in any case, I mean, this is not going to be settled. It's not going to be settled by definition because Venezuela is not going to accept a resolution that comes from the ICJ. But at the same time, given how long this is going to take, I mean, the US does not need it to be solved in order to do what it wants to do, which is, in this case, extract this massive oil wealth from the Essequibo waters. It might very well be, I mean, there are estimations that the reserves are going to be depleted quite quickly, that by the time there is any kind of ruling, ExxonMobil will have extracted all the wealth that it requires, and it no longer becomes useful. But the Essequibo issue has been part of growing efforts to attack Venezuela on multiple fronts. I mean, again, we have to understand that this does not begin with Trump. And right now, when we see this encircling siege in Venezuela, there's a very strong and growing U.S. presence in the Caribbean. Just this weekend, there are military exercises going on in Trinidad. A few months ago, there was a renewal of a joint military agreement between the U.S. and Trinidad, which was already in place. But the new one had the very specific and dangerous characteristic that it's open-ended. So it's not something that can be automatically activated. In theory, the Trinidadian government would have to authorize the use of its territory for a war. In this case, I mean, very specific against Venezuela, but this is an open-ended agreement, which is kind of a different precedent. Also, we saw U.S. pressuring Grenada to install radars and personnel and equipment in that island. The Grenadians, I mean, there have been very strong opposition, and they have tried to stall it on bureaucratic means. There was also a visit to Antigua, and the Antigua and Barbuda Prime Minister said that the country had no interest in hosting U.S. military assets. But the Guyana issue has been used over time to solve these divisions in the Caribbean community. And this ties to something else. I mean, if we recall when there was the Lima group, the unfortunate Lima group that was created solely for the purpose of trying to overthrow the government in Venezuela. One of the consistent efforts was to use the OAS charter against Venezuela. And there were, before Venezuela said, the OAS is the quote unquote Ministry of Colonies, we're not going to stay here, and left. But there were these successive votes in the OAS, which were consistently blocked by Caribbean countries, by their by and large abstention and opposing these efforts. And these responded to what Maria was saying before, very successful and very positive diplomatic efforts from Venezuela in terms of not just thinking about itself, but thinking about regional integration and freeing the region from the yoke of US imperialism. And one of the key programs for this was Petrocaribe. Petrocaribe, it has been much maligned as giving away oil, and it wasn't anything like that. It was providing these small Caribbean islands with oil and fuel, not for free, but at very favorable conditions, not just for their own development, but also to free them from the pressure of having to secure these resources from the United States. And then, when we see, beginning in 2015, but escalating from 2017, US sanctions, especially against the Venezuelan oil industry, this completely torpedoed Petrocaribe. And Venezuela was unable to continue the program, which again left these countries much more vulnerable to US pressure, on the economic side, and we've seen recently from a military perspective. So the Guyana flank is simmering. It doesn't look like the US is going to need any kind of proxy excuse right now. They're very blatantly built on this false narco-terrorism narrative that they're going to intervene directly. There was also, possibility which exists of using, Guyanese territory as a platform for a land invasion. Geographically and from looking at the conditions, I don't think it's very likely. This is very dense jungle territory. It's very far from the most important points of interest, which are, the capital and surrounding areas. But of course, it might be another stage in this US escalation against Venezuela if it does need another excuse, which, given how easily the US manufactures these reasons for the military buildup, I'm not sure that's necessarily on the cards. So, just to summarize, the Guyana flank has been used, over time to, weaken Venezuela, to deprive it of these resources, which are massive and very lucrative, and having one of the main US corporations profit from them, but also to break this. It was never, let's say, a monolithic unit in the Caribbean community, but there was a very strong feeling of looking towards regional integration and opposing, the consistent US influence in the region. This has been weakened over time through multiple fronts, the diplomatic front, the Guyanese effort, and also the long-term and direct and indirect consequences of sanctions. And now we are seeing a more direct approach of directly installing military assets in Caribbean islands as part of this present buildup and aggression against Venezuela. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.